Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim O'Hara. I'm with the Lake States region, and I also serve as the Government Affairs Director for the Forest Resources Association. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start our meeting. There are credits being offered from 4 programs: SAF Continuing Forest Education credits, Minnesota SFI, Michigan SFI credits, and also Wisconsin credits. If you are not speaking, please put your phones on mute. So this will keep the interference to a minimum. Also, if you have questions during the presentations, you could do it one of 2 ways. You can go down to your bottom of the screen and your several icons will pop up. There's a chat button there, so you can hit the chat button. You can send a question directly to myself, or you can send it to the whole group if you would like the entire group to see your question. If your name is not on the email or the participant list and you have your phone number there, please email or put in a chat feature your name that is associated with that number, and we can add your name to the list. That's important, especially if you're applying for continuing education credits. And that will be all. So today's meeting, it's pretty important. The COVID pandemic has certainly impacted a number of us in the industry. And the Lake States region is quite unique. We have quite a mix of land ownership. Public lands across the region contribute 40% of the timber output, so very important part of the timber supply chain. And they own roughly about the same amount of timberland acres. I believe it's around 38%. So our first speaker is Mike Powell, but I will let Chad Morgan, who is the chair of the Lake States Region Policy Committee. And Chad is with Louisiana Pacific in Hayward and serves as their resource manager. So Chad, I'll turn the meeting over to you for some opening remarks.
All right, thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our 2020 virtual version of the FRA Lake State Annual Fall Meeting. Obviously, we had hoped to meet in person this year, I think in eastern Wisconsin or the UP, but we had to cancel that and go this route. I'm hoping everyone is staying healthy and well during these tough times. Like Tim said, our theme is impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a lineup of several guest speakers who will discuss how the pandemic has affected their organization as well as the forest industry. And I'd like to thank Tim and probably Claire and the other FRA folks who helped organize and coordinate this. You did a great job as usual. So we're going to have 9 speakers, and then we're going to follow up with presenting the Outstanding Logger of the Year award. And I think the plan is for me to introduce each speaker, and then like Tim said, you can ask questions when we're done. So with that, I'm going to get started with our first speaker, Mike Powell. Mike is Forest to Market's Client Solutions Specialist. He is responsible for product sales throughout North America, where he helps clients uncover supply chain inefficiencies with the application of Forest to Market reports and price databases. He previously worked as a procurement forester at Carolina Forest Products and was an area manager and timber buyer at Virginia-based Timco. Mike received a BS in Forest Management from NC State University and is a registered forester in North Carolina. So with that, Mike, you can take it away.
Thanks, Chad. Let me, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. So if y'all can let me know whenever that, make sure that shows up the way it's supposed to. And let's see here. And then I'm going to turn my, can everybody see that?
Yes. We can, Mike.
Yeah, it's on my screen.
Okay, good. Great. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Tim and the FRA for having us and letting me speak today. As Chad mentioned, my name's Mike Powell, and I'm with Forest to Market. I'll skip the intro with a little bit about myself. I believe Chad did a pretty good job summarizing that. I've been with Forest to Market just under 2 years here, and as mentioned prior to the first part of my career, I spent in the woods in Southern Virginia and Northern North Carolina on the procurement side of things, but really enjoyed the transition. It's been really allowed me to stay in the industry that I really have a lot of passion for, but I'm able to kind of see the forest product supply chain through a slightly different lens, which has been very rewarding. Let's kind of jump in here. So kind of to start things off, as we generally like to do with most of our presentations, I know a good bit of y'all are probably familiar with Forest to Market, but for those who aren't, I kind of want to start with an overview of who we are. And after that, we'll kind of give you a quick update on the industry, both nationally, and then we'll focus on a little bit more specific to the Lake States, with the main topic, of course, kind of looking at COVID and how it has impacted everything this year. Certainly, it's been been an interesting year for sure. So a little background on Forest to Market. So at the very core, Forest to Market is a data and information service company. We work with all types of participants throughout the industry, from the small private landowners really to the large wood consuming mills. The primary goal at Forest to Market, as you can see on the mission statement here, is really to empower our participants throughout the industry and help them make exponentially better decisions using industry expertise and our unique price data sets. The way we do that is by collecting price data on raw materials at various points within the supply chain to help bring transparency to the marketplace. A little bit of history. So Forest to Market was started back in 2001 by Pete Stewart, who I'm sure many of you have met or heard of or spoken to. And it started out as really a stumpage price database. Since then, we've expanded quite a bit, launched several new products. We began doing some stumpage price forecasting in 2005, and that shortly led to the launch of our delivered price database in the Southeast U.S. From there, we expanded into the Pacific Northwest, and in 2009, we launched our lumber price report and benchmark. So then over the last several years, our delivered cost benchmark has spread further, focusing on the Lake States region and the Northeast, which we'll be looking into a little bit today. And most recently, we have been expanding internationally, working on benchmarks in Brazil and the Baltic states. So 2019, we had a little bit of organizational change. We were acquired by a private equity firm, Battery Ventures, who also bought Fisher International, who has been a long-standing benchmarking service within the paper, pulp and paper industry, and merged the two companies. Pete Stewart still oversees it as the CEO of both companies, and we've gone through a little bit of a period of growth and change, but one with Fisher's information is along with ours, we feel like it's one that's really going to benefit all of our customers. This is just kind of a map representing, as I mentioned, we started in North America, where we've expanded into Brazil, the Baltic Rim, and as well as we have some partnerships in Australia. This is just a breakdown of kind of how we view the different regions. Obviously, with the U.S. South, and we have the Northeast, the Lake States, and the Pacific Northwest. So I really like to think of these as really the four pillars that Forest to Market stands on. If any of these were to go away or fall, it would really impact our business in a pretty serious standpoint. Our promise is to deliver all four of these things to the client: quality, confidentiality, accuracy, and compliance. Again, none more important than the other. We work to deliver the best quality data around. We take many steps throughout the process to make sure that we are collecting and distributing quality data to all of our clients. Confidentiality is a huge part of our business as we work with actual transactional data. Without confidentiality, there would be no Forest to Market. We take extreme measures to ensure all of our customers' data is always secure and reports are always held anonymous. Accuracy. Our goal is to produce the most accurate reports on the market. We do believe that we do a pretty good job at this. Two examples: ensuring accuracy is that every transaction is counted. So when we work with customers, we collect 100% of the transactions, as well as the results are volume weighted. And compliance. We ensure that all of our products are compliant with U.S. antitrust. And so our main goal at Forest to Market, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is really to empower the participants in the forest wood products and paper products industry, really to make exponentially better decisions through the strategic application of the industry expertise and price data sets. This means we want to help everyone from the small private landowner all the way up to the very large investment firms that owns millions of acres, as well as the large industrial companies that use these raw materials coming off these landowners in their businesses. So we accomplish this by collecting real-time market data that's based on actual transactions. It's not survey driven. We get this information from the industry participants throughout the supply chain: landowners, wood dealers, loggers, consultants, and forest products companies. And we compare data sets with the large amount of industry expertise in our team, and to build tools to help all of our customers better understand and operate in the marketplace. Real briefly, I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on this, but I'm sure some are familiar, some aren't, but you'll see some of the graphs and representations that we go through from here on. And one of the how we kind of deliver a lot of this data throughout the industry is our Silvestat platform, Silvestat 360. And you can kind of see some of the metrics, where we help companies monitor their overall market price in comparison to the market, by looking at their product mix, their price distribution, looking at a mill overall, comparing freight, procurement expense, fiber cost, and so on a mill to mill base. So you can see here, again, kind of the confidentiality. All these are actual participating and operating mills in the region, but everything is held to a unique ID and confidential, as well as tracking inventory trends and how that affects price, allowing for procurement managers and mill managers to better understand the pinch points throughout their operation. So as many of you are aware, it's kind of become a little bit of a tradition for Pete Stewart, who's our president, that at the beginning of every year, he puts out a list of predictions for the next 12 months, trying to look at the big trends in the industry. And I'm going to play a little bit of a Monday morning quarterback here. And I thought it would be a fun exercise to kind of do the pre-COVID look and see how many we got right and how many were missed. I don't know how thrilled Pete would be if we were playing, like I said, playing Monday morning quarterback, but thought this would be a good look. So the global pulp markets will soften. This one is not quite as clear cut as COVID has definitely increased the demand in some sectors, while really pushing some down even faster. U.S. South saw timber markets will flatten. I would say this is correct. Oversupply of the resource in the U.S. South is still a very large driver in the marketplace, keeping the prices in check. U.S. hardwood industry will continue to face challenges, but decreases will be moderate. I'd say this one was kind of wrong. The hardwood markets have definitely faced harder than expected times. We had a little bit of a bright spot in the very beginning of the year. It looked like some things were starting to trend in the right direction, and then obviously March 17th happened, and everything kind of got flipped upside down. So COVID has definitely sped up the decline in the hardwood markets. U.S. housing starts will taper. I would say correct. They have remained stronger than anyone really could have imagined, and at times really were pretty impactful on the lumber markets. But technically, throughout the pandemic, they have been down year over year. The U.S. dollar will maintain its strength. That was not the case, obviously, due to with the COVID impacts. The Brazilian forest sector will stagnate. Correct. COVID is this has been a global pandemic, and it has hit Brazil as hard as it has the rest of the world. Market pulp has been a bit of a bright spot with the tissue and toilet paper demand during the pandemic. British Columbia will curtail more lumber production. I would say correct. We've continued to see production come out of BC, and the solid wood industry is continually looking at the U.S. South to fill that void. CLT and engineered wood products will continue to grow rapidly. This is another one that I'll give a check mark for. I wouldn't necessarily say you have to you have to maybe say growing rapidly with a grain of salt, but we are seeing some positive movement. The global economy will shrink, GDP will follow. I believe this is correct. I don't think we predicted the driver of this or how much it would shrink. I believe it's projected down 1% projected right now. And lastly, the forest industry in the Pacific Northwest will plug along. I would say a few months ago, when we were first starting to kind of come out of this, I would say we got this one right. But I think the Pacific Northwest region is definitely looking at some additional hard times with the supply and with the persisting fires out there. So kind of go through a little bit of the state of economy. Manufacturing, second quarter was pretty rough, not exactly groundbreaking there, as everybody's kind of felt the weight of the pandemic hitting. 31% is, down 31% is slightly better than we expected. The manufacturing sector continues to improve and heal. More and more businesses are opening up, and people are beginning to demand goods. Though it is a mixed bag for recovery. Some industries have done well while others are continuing to struggle. On a whole, we're still not quite back where we were to pre-pandemic levels. It has felt like in a way that the U.S. economy is really beginning to heal and rebound, or at least if you take a look at the stock markets. But there have been many people worried about the underlying foundation of kind of what the long-term effects are going to be. So kind of taking a look at the solid wood, I think everyone knows this story probably all too well. Solid wood sector was hit extremely hard right at the beginning of the pandemic. Housing starts plummeted, lumber demand fell off, and a lot of mills were kind of faced with the tough decision of either to continue to run or pull back on the production, and as things looked like they were continuing to get worse. A lot of your larger producers did make this call to curtail production, slow down so as not build their inventories. And then kind of, what really happened next, nobody saw coming. And I can personally attest to with all the home improvements that my wife has had me doing while I've been stuck at home. But housing rebounded fairly quickly and the remodel sector boomed. Everyone stayed at home throughout the quarantine, decided it was a good time to, finish the deck and, build the shelves, and the lumber demand really just went through the roof, and the big box stores, ate up inventories the mills had. By the time the mills could react and the production ramped back up, the shortage of supply was there, and we had a big gap in the supply chain, and this caused as I'm sure y'all have seen articles and read and experienced, it caused a run on the lumber prices that was historical. There was a comma per thousand. Only now, it does seem like inventories are catching up. We're seeing the prices, continually return back down to more consistent numbers. So you can kind of see here, this is just a pull from some of our lumber data, and you can kind of see the story play out. Here, this is for the U.S. South, but so what you're looking at is Southern Yellow Pine lumber price, and you can, I think it's pretty obvious which line is 2020, but you can see the dip in the prices starting in March, and then the run that took place from April until just several weeks ago, and we've continued to see this number return back down to more so in this region here. So taking a look at the Pacific Northwest lumber markets, they show a very similar story. The graph isn't quite as complete as on the Southern Yellow Pine, but the building sector has been starved for lumber since April, and every region that produced lumber following the COVID impacts has been benefiting from this. Prices in the West reacted very similar to the South, and you can kind of, but we can see also once we run this out, the prices are starting to return back down. So jumping over to the pulp and paper side, pulp and paper really made a lot of headlines early as everybody was rushing and buying up toilet paper to stock up their new home offices and apparently their garages and their closets and everything. So really put a spotlight on it. You're there for a while. It looked like the roll of toilet paper was going to be the next dollar bill. But overall, the growth of the industry has been pretty flat across the country. Grades that utilize hardwood fiber are the ones that have really been bearing the brunt. The mills that typically focus on the grades are in decline, and the pandemic really just sped that up. It really just increased the decline of these markets. Unfortunately, it's just not a tremendous, not much that really indicates tremendous future growth in the hardwood pulp market. And you can kind of see this play out here. So these are the grade trends in North America, and you can see the printing and writing along with the newsprint are the grades that are in decline. Typically, those are the grades that utilize hardwood fiber. It's not something that was necessarily, as I mentioned, that was brought on by COVID. As you can see, these are going to be, so this is printing and writing, and this is newsprint. So, I mean, they've been in decline, just as the world's been changing, but they definitely think COVID put a little bit more, sped up that process a little bit. The container board and market pulp and tissue and towel are stable and growing grades. They're definitely the ones that we see to be driving the pulp and paper industry going forward. So as I kind of mentioned so Southern timber prices, oversupply definitely continues to dominate and keep prices in check. Since the recession, saw logs, there was a pullback at the beginning of the pandemic. We saw lumber prices retreating, thinking the lumber demand was going to be hit hard. A lot of the procurement teams only bought what was absolutely needed. Demand has rebounded, but you haven't really seen much of a move in the prices, again, just due to that large oversupply in the U.S. South, keeping the demand's there, but the supply's right behind it. Strong demand on the pulpwood side throughout the pandemic, but again, oversupply has really been the main storyline. So Pacific Northwest, outside of COVID, like I said, things were looking well, and they were plugging along. And then, obviously, as we've all seen in the news, the fires over the past couple of months have been, really the big story in the Pacific Northwest is, this year's fire season. The losses are obviously high, areas ranging anywhere from, 5,000 to 200,000 acres. Reforestation is going to be a cumbersome process, really take decades probably, which will probably in the long term have downstream effects on the supply. Currently, salvage logging is the priority with the mills that are running this material. We've seen some devaluation on the smaller logs that sustained more damage, but most of the larger logs seem to have less damage and less devaluation. One of the interesting things I heard about the nature of these fires and what made them so different was the wind direction and persistence was pushing the fires down into the, more down the mountains, which was getting into more of the younger stands and obviously, creating more damage. So as we've discussed, the lumber and panel markets have been very strong. Some mills in the region have been pushing to produce as much as they possibly can. With supply already tight in the region, which is the exact opposite of the U.S. South with the fires. It really exacerbated this, and we've seen an uptick in pricing as the demands increase. The supply has not been there quite as strong. Exports have been a bit of a struggle. Really due to several reasons, one being trade disputes. The volumes are well below historically what we've seen. The prices are still depressed relative to the recent past, but we are seeing some rebound and pull from China markets as the price is low. So the export markets have definitely throughout COVID have had a challenge. Really, to summarize kind of everything we went over, as the demand and resource dynamics affected the timberland ownership directly. In the South, again, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but really the supply, the resource availability in the South is really driving the narrative and likely will for some time. There's been strong demand, but it's been overshadowed, keeping the prices in check. Pacific Northwest, they're kind of in the opposite. They've had a big loss of supply stemming from the wildfires, and it's restricted the opportunity for the markets to grow. The Lake States in the Northeast, the lumber markets have been a bright spot for the softwood logs. The hardwood markets do continue to struggle. COVID has amplified this with the closure of Verso and Duluth, and obviously the unfortunate events that we saw with the J mill. So that's kind of a recap on the from a whole, and now kind of what I want to do is kind of get a little more specific to the Lake States region. But I also don't want to just repeat on everything that we've been talking about so far today. So everyone listening has kind of heard the state of the industry. is likely, probably too familiar with some of the struggles. So the recipe of what we're seeing in the Lake States region is really a high cost for raw materials coupled with production facilities that are focused on sectors that are in decline. So what you can see here is you can see the Lake States is currently the third highest cost for softwood fiber. It's not terrible, but it's a long way from places like the U.S. South and Brazil. And, as for hardwood, it's much tighter cluster, and, Lake States is much more competitive, but kind of what we mentioned earlier, a lot of the grades that utilize hardwood fiber are mostly into decline. And you can see down here at the bottom, Brazil is the leader by a long shot. So really, by looking at this, at any new production that needs hardwood, you would think is likely going to go to Brazil. We can see some of the more, impacts along this trend COVID has had in the region in our data. So this is just kind of a, quick graph. So this is just showing the COVID related closures, the reduction that we've seen in the paper market. So you can see roughly 9.3 tons were affected, and looking at probably going to have a reduction in about 2.4 million tons, which is about 25% or so, due to the COVID-related closures we've seen over the past several months. Pete Kuchu, who I'm sure a lot of y'all are very familiar with, recently did some analysis, pulling together some of Forest to Market's data across the U.S. and looking at consumption trends and how these have changed in the wake of COVID. Production curtailments across the nation have really led to a significant drop in the raw material consumption, down almost 6.7%. It's had huge rippling impacts across the industry, from the mill all throughout the supply chain, from the loggers down to the truckers and the timberland owners. And it's estimated that those impacts are, as you can see right here, close to $1.83 billion. So it's definitely been a huge impact. Pete did a couple articles, and he's had several articles come out throughout the year, looking at the various regions. So I kind of wanted to highlight the one that he did here in the Lake States in the Northeast. The impact of COVID is seen a little bit easier in the southern data, as the deliveries aren't typically as seasonal, but kind of wanted to go through this as it would be a little more relevant. So kind of first off, if you look here at this graph, kind of make sure we know what we're looking at. This is a chart of the total fiber consumption or wood deliveries to the mills monthly from January 2018 to June 2020. So this is representing the first point of purchase data that we received in part of our database on the Silvastat. So you can see, when the deliveries typically peak January through March, ground's frozen, harvest is more efficient, can work tracks. And as you move into the spring, second quarter, deliveries really drop off as the mills begin utilizing their inventories they have built up during the winter, since the harvesting becomes much more difficult during the breakup period. So really, if you think about that going into second quarter, so the timing of COVID really kind of hides the impact at the first glance. Looking here, it just looks like any other year. But what we've done here, when you compare it to the same period over the last several years, the total volume moved in 2020 second quarter was over 20% less than the previous years. So you can see it looks like it's following the same trend, but you can obviously see it's dipped down further than it has. Main driver of this, the culprit, I'd say, is kind of what we mentioned earlier: mill closures in the region and curtailing of production, which was largely driven by COVID. But another thing, and I don't know if this is, I can't tell if my Zoom is blocking it, but you can see here, it does appear that the Northeast region is rebounding from this, from this breakup period a little faster than Lake States. So this is definitely something that we're going to keep an eye on and see how that looks. But when looking at each region side by side, the Lake States has certainly been one of the hardest hit areas across the country. So really for me, the big question when thinking about the Lake States is kind of what will drive the capital back into the region and bolster the economy. So kind of put together some high level bullets on really what drives the capital investment. Kind of first and foremost is, good markets for finished products. And then of course, raw material availability and ownership structure but also the infrastructure to move the material. This really gets, at the price and cost of the supply chain. And, an ability to see that in the market and understand the advantages and the disadvantages that do exist throughout. So, so the region, like I said, is definitely has its challenges in front of it, but trying to be, glass half full, stay positive here. I think there are some real opportunities as well. The Lake States has a lot of high quality timber resource, that is majorly privately owned. Have strong markets for softwood lumber, and so the mills that have been, mills that are producing softwood lumber are strong currently. But the big driver here is relative to the other regions. Resource cost is high. So the big question mark, for strong markets and end products is, really, and what we're looking at is what will it be and where will it come from? I would say that with the hardwood markets looking the way they're looking, we're kind of focusing on kind of what's going to be the future for the region. So, and that's pretty quickly what we had put together for you guys. I hope that made sense and was not just a bunch of rambling, because I'm just talking to a computer screen versus typically you at least see people shaking their heads, no, you're wrong, or nodding and saying, yes, you're right, when you get to give one of these in real life. So I'll turn it over to y'all to tell, but like I said, appreciate y'all letting us come in, and hopefully that was informative.
Are there any questions? There's nothing on the chat line, but does anybody have a question they would like to ask Mike? If not, Mike, if you go back to slides 25 and 26.
Let's see here.
One of those will be, okay. So if you look at those slides, so there's a number of factors that go into the delivery costs, stumpage, transportation, processing. If you look at the Lake States and how they compare to Brazil, the South, are those factors, like, is transportation number one all across the board for the highest costs of that, or do they differ in terms of percent contributing to those delivered wood costs? So stumpage, for instance, is that the highest contributor to the cost in Brazil and the South, and compared to the Lake States?
Yeah, so that would be interesting, Tim. That's a really good question. That would be something that we could kind of look into. I definitely think stumpage is one of the higher costs that equates to that, but I don't actually have that. We'd have to look back and kind of see what the largest driver. So this is really just going to be an overall wood fiber cost. So obviously, like you mentioned, it's going to have all the components building it up. So that would be something that would be interesting to look at. But I know stumpage is definitely one of the larger.
And question if the slideshow will be made available to participants.
Yeah, we can. Typically, what we'll do here is I'll send this back, and we can. We might have to redact some of the some of the numbers and stuff, but I'll try to get an example or I guess a version that we can send out, and I'll get with you, Tim, and send that over.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Chad, I think there's nothing else. I'll turn it back to you.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you, Mike.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you, guys.
We appreciate that.
Wait. Got a question here. Does access to Great Lakes shipping terminals help with potential exports?
Yeah, so I would say so. The Lake States are geographically, they're a little bit, I guess, disadvantaged, when it comes to the export markets. So obviously any improvements on that would be beneficial. Is that?
Thanks.
Yep.
So, Tim, I've got a quick question. Hi, Chad. This is Deb Hawkinson, and I'm curious, as you all look at for your forecasting, what are the key things that that are ahead of us that you will be taking into consideration? So like, or do you have key points in time when you're going to go back and review all of this, whether it's the elections or the vaccine or just things that I think overall we're all watching to see how the recovery starts to look?
Yeah, that's a good question, Deb. And I think that it's definitely, it's like with anything, whether it be, any, I don't want to say destructive, because this, but any event, any market changing event, typically whether it be a hurricane or this COVID. I mean, this one's a little unique, obviously, because it's so, it's unprecedented. So we're tracking it constantly. I definitely think things like the election are going to have impacts. I think the vaccine is going to have impacts. When do we go back to whatever this, is it a new normal or is it back to normal? And so I think as that continues to play out, but again, I think as with any event, typically you see these immediate impacts and these immediate, well, what happens right now, and then it's kind of a ripple effect. There's going to be things that this has, like we've kind of seen with some of the mill closures, kind of speeding up some of that, and then there's going to be future impacts down the road. And so really we monitor it, constantly. And really just as new developments come up and as new changes take place. But I would say, really monthly is kind of the resolution in which we follow a lot of this. But there for a while, it was changing every day.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I know I'll be looking to you all to kind of help us see what that future outlook looks like.
Absolutely.
And Mike, we got one more late arrival question. Any idea how much pulp is imported to the Lake States region for paper making?
I do not have. I could get that number. I do not know that number off the top of my head. No.
Okay, thanks.
I apologize.
Well, I'll follow up with you, Mike.
Okay, great.
All right, see no more questions. Chad, back to you once again.
Yes, do we want to take the screen back, Tim?
Yeah, I can unshare it here.
Yeah, I think
I
Jacob can do that.
While they're doing that, yep. So, yep, thanks again, Mike.
Thank you, guys.
Speaker is Heather Birkland, and Heather is the brand new Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry Chief State Forester. She oversees and directs all policies and programs for the division. In addition, she continues to foster and build collaborative partnerships within the greater forestry community to help sustainably manage our forests for social, economic, and ecological benefits to the public. Heather's been with the department for over 20 years in various roles, and her office is located in Rhinelander. So with that, it's all yours, Heather.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I'm going to be tag teaming this presentation with two other of our specialists. So I will kick this off, and super excited to be here representing the Division of Forestry with Wisconsin DNR. In my previous role as the deputy, I was able to work with many of you. So really honored, and as always, if there's something you need from the division, don't hesitate to reach out. So I know we have a lot of panel members and report outs, so we'll try and keep this brief and high level. Go on to the next slide, please. So just a little bit on the successes of the division during last year, even with the COVID pandemic and a few other things that got thrown our way. Just a little snapshot is, for DNR public lands, we own about 1.5 million acres, and roughly 538,000 is in our state forests that we oversee and manage. But we are also kind of the experts in helping establish sales on our other state properties, which includes like our parks, state parks, our natural areas, our wildlife properties. And then also the timber sale program is very much a partnership with our county forest programs and in our National Forest Good Neighbor Authority agreement. Next slide, please. So what were we able to accomplish? Right around our annual allowable harvest is about 18,000 acres. And this is what we did complete last calendar year, and including much of what there was the 2019 blowdown. And so if you look at our accomplishments from 2019 to roughly our end of our fiscal year, about 20% of the wood that we put to market was in salvage. So that's kind of an important piece going forward. Much of that effort has been cleaned up, but is still in progress on with our national forest partners. Go to the next slide, please. So as you can see, this one's probably a little bit hard to read, but this kind of shows the trends of the wood that comes off of our state properties in Wisconsin. Roughly, we depend quite a bit on our state forests, but it's about a little bit equal to what comes off of our other state lands as well. But on average and going forward, our annual allowable harvest is hovering right around that 18,000 acre mark. And just want to throw out within the Good Neighbor Authority, we've been partnering to put out about 30 million board feet, 70,000 cord equivalent the last several years, but that will increase to 45 million board feet given some of the salvage and the extra sales related to that. So next slide, please. So kind of where we're at in the division and the department in general, given the COVID impacts. We did not take any extreme measures with halting our sale establish and administration of existing sales this past spring and summer and to this point. And we continued with bid openings back in May and June, but they went virtual. We've been getting some good feedback that it was successful in being able to kind of go that route. And utmost importance has been our staff and partner safety. We really took measures. Many of us have been teleworking since March. However, we were pleased that forestry and forest industry was considered an essential service. So much of our field staff was able to continue to work in the woods independently and continue to establish sales both on our properties and with our partner properties. I would say going forward, we're kind of continuing in that, continuing as is, but Doug, I think will hit on, and Colin as well as some of the conversations we continue to have to assess that. For hiring from a department standpoint and a statewide standpoint, we've been at a hiring pause. We were able to move forward with a few positions this past spring that were already kind of in the queue, and that some of them we've been given priority if they are related to kind of the essential kind of fire and emergency response going forward. But we did get to hire 11 new forestry field technicians and an invasive species coordinator, a GIS specialist, and then our public and private land section chief, which would oversee much of our timber programs. And then of course, finally able to get a chief state forester in place as well. So very much under scrutiny on the positions we'll be able to hire moving forward, but we continue to have those conversations at the department level. And the department is continuing to assess how we can continue to support partners industry but still maintaining that safety amongst our staff and the public. For training, much of what we do is we support training for many of our partners, but also internally, and we did put a pause on that, kind of reassessed what that training looks like, but have been able to put on and move forward with some virtual options and some limited face-to-face options as well. And that too will continue to be assessed into this next year. And then some big changes this past spring was with our nurseries program. We had to defer most of the nursery orders given we couldn't distribute those orders safely amongst COVID this past spring, but happy to report that we're very much on the upswing of orders for this fall already. And so hopefully we won't be in the same scenario this spring and folks will be able to get their tree planting done. Prescribed burning, we did halt on that as well, just for the public and our firefighter safety. However, more recently this summer and fall, we have been able to use that as a management tool, and have gotten some limited prescribed burning done currently. And then just a mention of our tax law program, we did defer enforcement action on any mandatory practices as well, for those landowners that may be impacted due to COVID and some of the market issues. So through this year, fiscal year, we will not be taking any enforcement action for those that couldn't complete their mandatory practices. So I would say moving forward from a high level, we're going to continue to assess what our priority needs are, what our partner priority needs are. We're going to continue to telework where we can. Hopefully our staff are still given the flexibility to work independently and work out in the woods to continue to keep wood going to the market. And then, yeah, just staying connected to understand some of the impacts going forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the next slide for Doug.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Doug Brown. I'm the County Forest and Public Land Specialist for Division of Forestry. And so a couple of things we've done in the last year in reaction and working with contractors, one due to COVID and just other things we've been watching in the market. So with the COVID and the slowdown in the markets and hearing our we call them customers, our the contractors, logging contractors, our externals. We did a 1-year timber sale extension on all timber sales in their original contract date as well as in their first year. So we gave them a free 1-year extension. It was offered out, and if the contractor wanted it, they just said, "Yep, sign me up," and so that went through. And just previous to that, we had gone through and looked at our entire timber sale program, and we enacted new timber sale contract lengths. Historically, the state's been a 2-year contract with a 1-year extension at basically a 5%. And we went with a standard 3-year contract. And if any timber sale had required winter only ground for whatever reason, the contract was guaranteed for at least 3 winters. So in essence, a lot of our timber sales went from a 2-year contract to maybe even a 3.6-year contract. So if they were offered in the fall, they were guaranteed 3 winters, and then they were going to all end in the end of June, 3.5 years later. So we wanted more opportunities for contractors. We've understood winters have been getting tougher. And so we want to ensure that they had enough time, as well as there's a cost saving involved with having to redo contracts, redoing bonds for contractors. So we're trying to work with them to just make the whole process a little easier. We're also looking, particularly with the Verso shutdown, we're still evaluating, taking a hard look at all of our timber sales. We have, in essence, over 500 contracts on the books, and we're taking a hard look at where we're going to go forward. We understand we already have areas in the state that are challenging to get rid of pulpwood. We already have areas in the state that it's just difficult to sell winter only sales as it is, particularly with the winters being shorter, wetter. We're taking a harder evaluation of what we try to offer for the contractors. So in rather a short amount of time, we've been doing a lot of analysis and going through our contracts and looking at how we're doing business, not just because of COVID, but because of what our externals have been asking. But now the big one is because of the Verso closure and the potential long-term impacts on how we do business. Next slide, and I think it's for you, Colin.
Yeah, good afternoon, Colin Buntrock. I'm the team leader of the Forest Product Services Program with the division based in Rhinelander. And sort of to carry forward what Doug just left off with, it's no surprise, to many of you on the call, just with Verso idling and how just that's really a major concern moving forward. Not only are ability to market our timber sales, but also, just how big of an impact this has on our partners in logging and the trucking community. Just a big concern, for all of us in the forestry community. Similarly with sawmilling, just for our sawmills to access saw timber, just how important that link is between pulpwood markets and saw timber access. That's a concern certainly we've heard in the division, and as we move forward, just a concern is with how our hardwood pulpwood markets will respond, and then just our ability to have sales with balsam and other softwoods like tamarack and other softwood species. So Doug hit on this a little bit, but just another challenge, and I would say an opportunity that we've had discussions internally is just with areas of the state where we've had historically limited pulpwood demand, ways to get creative and to work with partners to be able to get forest management activities done in these areas of the state. So southern Wisconsin and far western Wisconsin are two examples. So kind of a challenge, but also maybe an opportunity moving forward. And I think that's what we had for our panel.
All right. Do we have any questions for this group?
Chad, nothing on the screen yet, but I think as we move on, we'll, if you have questions for any of the panel, just submit them during the presentation and we'll field them out to the appropriate folks at the end of the panel discussions.
Sure. Actually, I have a question for the group. So with all these changes in markets, have you looked at, different scenarios of different cutting specs, different utilization standards at the state level, at MFL? Have you looked into any of that or thought about it?
You want me to take that one, Heather?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So Chad, we're looking at everything right now. We're getting a lot of questions from field staff like, hey, how are we going to handle this? How are we going to handle that? And right now we're taking in everything on different opportunities on how we move forward in doing timber. It could include specs. It could even include one idea has already been floated out in the very southern part of the state where we have a very difficult time getting rid of pulpwood as it is. And now it's basically, it's not even there at all, is even contracting out. Like we contract with loggers and then you cut it, we market the wood. So we've talked with our externals. I know Rebecca Lutke with WCFA is on next, but talking with them and other counties on different specs. Right now, as this is the biggest fear we've always had here in Wisconsin, if that mill went down, and we're looking at everything. We're not gonna turn any ideas that it's just not gonna work, or we're not gonna stick our heels in the ground. The world's changing, and just as Colin and I already talked, the big areas of where we're gonna have these expanded bubbles of non-ability to move pulpwood, the West and the South, where the bubble's going to expand even greater. And really not just to do forest management, but in many cases on fish, wildlife, and parks properties, it's to do habitat restoration. Like how do we even create the savannas, create these barrens when we need to get these pesky trees out of the way and there's no place to send them. So how are we going to be able to accomplish this? So we're honest, we're looking at everything right now. We're taking in as much information as possible so that as we move towards as possible and listened. And Heather likes that pesky tree comment.
Well, it's gonna be a lot of tough decisions. So yeah, please keep us informed as you come up with solutions. So thank you, Heather, Colin, and Doug. If we have no other questions, we'll move on. We appreciate you joining us today. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Rebecca Lutke, and she is the executive director for the Wisconsin County Forest Association. She's based in Merrill. And the WCFA is a nonprofit quasi-government organization established in 1968. It provides a collaborative forum for considering issues, programs, and policies of its 30 member counties. And those counties collectively manage over 2.4 million acres. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully this works. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you can see that okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, it's up.
We can see it.
All right, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Again, Rebecca Ledke with the Wisconsin County Forest Association. I'm the executive director here. So what I thought I would do a little bit here to kind of introduce WCFA, introduce the county programs, work towards what our current situation is, and obviously, as everybody is talking about how COVID has impacted us, as well as what we are proposing going forward. So just a brief history on Wisconsin forests in general. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, massive timber operations and land clearing occurred across the states. By 1900, we were the leader in the nation for timber production. However, 1915, all those forests were gone. And in theory, the hope was that that we would be able to convert all of those forested acres to farmland, but obviously that failed in the northern half of the state due to all kinds of number of reasons. Obviously, companies and governments were trying to entice settlers to come to Wisconsin to to start farming, that type of stuff, but had little success. By 1927, over 4.5 million acres had become tax delinquent at least once, which left the counties cash poor. In the 1920s, the state legislature, in their forethought, introduced the forest crop law and the county forest reserve law. The reserve law allowed the counties to acquire those tax delinquent lands for their own use, establishing county forest reserves. So our first county forest was established in Langlade County, which is in 1928. The initial wave of 4 counties established during that time was about 38,000 acres. So as we moved on to the 30s through the 60s, by 1938, 24 county forests were established, totaling over 1.7 million acres. And then in the 60s, September of 63, the governor at that time, John Reynolds, signed the new county forest law into act, which was Wisconsin State Statute 2810 and 2811, which is really the golden rule, the Bible, whatever you want to call it, of county forest management going forward in Wisconsin here. So the Wisconsin County Forest Association, WCFA, was established in '68 really to help the counties through those growing pains. And I'll explain a little bit about WCFA later in the presentation, but where we're at today for the Wisconsin County Forest System, we currently have 30 counties in Wisconsin out of the 72, like Doug mentioned earlier, have over 2.4 million acres. We are currently the largest public land base in Wisconsin. As you can see on the graph on the right, the counties make up just about 46% of the public land base in Wisconsin. So really, as far as public landowners, the counties collectively are do the lion's share of the biggest landholder. We're unique to the nation in the fact that the counties are governed by state law. Again, State Statute 2811. Pre-Verso, the forestry industry was #1 employer in 10 counties, #1 in output for 14 counties, and currently contributed to sustaining 60,000 full-time jobs in Wisconsin's $24 billion industry. As with Verso, we'll see where those numbers shake out. It remains to be seen how we're all gonna fare. But Adams County became the 30th county just this past June, so we're very excited about that. Adams County is in central Wisconsin, and hopefully going forward we can continue to grow in that number. So this is just a brief map of the Wisconsin County forests in Wisconsin. Like I said, there are 30 of them, ranging pretty much from La Crosse up through Green Bay, and then the northern half to 2/3 of the state. So each lime green colored county is a member of WCFA, has county forest lands, and then the dark green is the actual county forested lands within those counties. So just briefly, these are our counties. They range in scope from Douglas County, which is up by Superior, Wisconsin, at over 280,000 acres, to Adams, who just joined, being our smallest at 140 acres. And it pretty much runs the gamut everywhere in between there. So very diverse, very intermixed with state, federal, private land ownerships. Each of them is very unique within their own right. Again, 2811 is what drives the county forests in Wisconsin. It's our purpose, it's our objective. Again, in the forethought of the state legislature in the 20s, establishing a permanent program for county forests for optimal production of timber products. They're multi-use, meaning they need to ensure maximum public benefits when we're talking about wildlife management, recreational opportunities, obviously timber production. And also because of that, the state also compensates the counties for those public uses, really when it comes to staff and time and energy by the DNR. So the DNR and the counties really have a very close, tight-knit dovetail relationship that continues to this day. So myself as the executive director work very closely with Heather and Doug and Colin to make sure that we both know which either of the other is doing, because it's impactful to both of us. So just a brief look at where the counties were in 2019, the past fiscal year for the counties. As you can see by both of the graphs, both on the page, is the counties pretty much take care of the lion's share of timber production on public owned lands in Wisconsin. We had just over 910,000 cords equivalent harvested last year for just about $44.5 million in timber sale receipts received. As I mentioned, county forested lands are multi-use, so we have a big job as far as timber and raw material production, but also in recreational opportunities. We do have the lion's share of public recreational services in the state as well, with lots of motorized ATV, snowmobile, public landings on county forested lands, as well as non-motorized use with thousands of miles of hiking, snowshoeing, bicycle trails, lots of day use, lots of campgrounds, and really, as far as public lands in Wisconsin, we also are one of the main drivers for outdoor tourism in Wisconsin as well. So just going forward, the counties are also certified. The vast majority of the counties are certified. They became certified in 2005. 19 counties are dual certified. The DNR actually holds the certificate for the counties. And in 2019, there was a full certification audit, which came out with no cars, no observations. It was a fully clean audit, full certification audit, which was clean, which was exciting. And actually in 2020, we came back with a clean audit as well. So we had back-to-back clean audits for the counties, which is very, very exciting. So moving on to what we need to talk about today is the impacts of COVID. So the initial stretch, as was mentioned before, of COVID came over breakup, which was a benefit, I suppose, if you could find one. as things were tapering off anyway, it was a good time for folks to be focusing on other things. However, as we were getting out of breakup, we started to see some impacts. Temporary and seasonal staffing took a hit because mainly with the recreational side of things, a lot of those recreation sites were closed. A lot of temporary staff that work for recreation, that type of stuff were not hired. A lot of local budgets tanked initially because of that. Revenue from recreation dropped or was redirected elsewhere. We did have some isolated furloughs in a number of counties. However, over time that has recovered as folks stuck close to home. And a lot of our counties have seen a positive in their budgets just with local sales tax revenue increasing over time. We did see a lot of visitors to county forest lands and recreational sites over the summer, which was both a positive and a negative. It was great that folks were getting out to forested county forest lands, but also was a stretch for some of the counties when they weren't able to hire temporary staff. So it was a challenging summer for a lot of the counties. Also, that came into effect was what Heather was talking about earlier, was the Safer at Home order, which obviously had impacts, like she said, on the DNR nursery, the prescribed burning program, and staff directions, which all of that impacts on what the counties can and cannot accomplish year in and year out. So there was some adjustment periods there. Also, we'll say it again, probably the biggest issue by far for the counties this year was the closure of the Verso plants, both in Wisconsin Rapids and Duluth. Verso consumes about roughly 20% of the county timber, accounting for about 16% of the timber revenue. Most of that 20% is the low grade hardwood pulp, which we're not exactly sure where that's going to go going forward. So it is a big concern, really, because that timber revenue that the counties receive goes straight back into their program. It goes back into the county, other county budgets, other county programs, especially it could have impact for, emergency management services, highway departments, et cetera, because the forestry departments are one of the big income drivers for the counties. So to get that number of reduction in timber revenue is going to have a pretty impact locally. Probably also will have effect on tax levies as well going forward. So beyond just talking about the money, it's serious implications to forest management when we need to talk about, forest health issues, whether it be insect or disease, just, maintaining and rolling over timber stands. Losing the Verso market is quite critical for us and is really high on our radar for what we need to accomplish, or hopefully find a silver line, or I don't know, a white knight, something like that to come in and hopefully correct that market a little bit. But regarding that, we have seen a slow in logging activity, not surprising, across most counties late fall or late summer into early fall here. And I think most of the timber auctions were pre-COVID back in the spring, with a number of auctions coming in the last couple weeks, and probably in the next month. A lot of our counties are having their timber auctions. And I would say so far, they haven't been as bad as we thought they would be. Definitely prices are down across the board, which was expected, but sale rates are also down, but not quite as down as we thought they would. So in reaction to COVID and Verso going forward, just to put a caveat out there, there are 30 counties. They all each individually act on their own. So there's not one single silver bullet for all of the counties in regards to reacting to the situation right now. They certainly talk about it, but they, at the end of the day, act individual. But I'll try to capture as much as I can for kind of the trends here for the counties. So extensions, pretty handily, the vast majority of the counties have offered extensions. They were offering extensions interest-free due to COVID before the Verso shutdown, and certainly are doing other extensions since the closures. Sale modifications, so existing sale price adjustments are being considered and or implemented. Our base stumpage rates have been greatly reduced in some counties, most counties, for new sales going forward. So the counties are taking it upon themselves to, adjust those rates as Mike was talking about earlier. We know that we have historically high stumpage rates, and so backing that off, trying to still get wood sold is important. Eliminating or reducing bid bonds is also being considered or enacted. Contract lengths are also being extended, just like with the DNR. Some of the counties are making their contracts longer. Utilization standards and species adjustments, specifically if it's not an impact to the silviculture prescription, utilization standards are being broadened. Species adjustments, specifically balsam fir, I want to say, especially in the northwest part of the state where balsam fir went to the Duluth mill, seeing really if we can work on modifying those species requirements within existing and new contracts to at least still get some management done. I would say the vast majority of the counties are doing it, or doing other considerations sale by sale or case by case basis, really giving the leeway to their foresters or their sale administrators to work with the contractors, work with the buyers to see how we can still get forest management done, but also not create any more problems or more burdens. Some counties are also, I would say just a couple, one or two I can only think of, that have postponed auctions until things not necessarily correct themselves, but at least even out as far as the market. And then for challenges for the counties going forward is, what are we doing with that 20% volume that normally would have gone to the Verso mill in Wisconsin Rapids or in Duluth? What do we do with it now? How do we still maintain our forest management, county budgets and tax levies with reduced timber activity and revenue? So those are our big challenges going forward. I think it remains to be seen how big of an impact it's going to be, but we're keeping a close eye on it. I won't get into this because I think I'm over time. I apologize for that, but just, WCFA in general acts as a clearinghouse and a forum for the consideration and collaboration for issues for all of the counties, rather than them each individually dealing with their own issues. They deal with it through the association, which again is a not-for-profit. Myself being the executive director kind of herds those cats, if you want to say, really acts as liaison and advocate for all of the counties collectively when we're dealing with multiple agencies of the legislature or other organizations. That's where WCFA comes in to play. So that's all I had. If there's any questions, or I will turn my screen off.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Does anyone have any questions? All right. We'll move on to our next speaker. Craig Schmid is the Deputy Director of the Minnesota DNR Division of Forestry. Craig graduated from Virginia Tech with a BS in Forestry and Wildlife after completing an AAS in Forest Management at Dabney Lancaster Community College in Virginia. For 32 years, Craig has worked for the Minnesota DNR, holding positions from entry-level field forester to deputy director. He has also worked in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania for the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, before moving back to Minnesota. So welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Chad. I won't be sharing my screen and I don't have any slides for you, and I will try to be brief. It sounds like our experience here at Minnesota DNR is very similar to Wisconsin. It is a pleasure to present to you after Rebecca Ludke. Hi, Rebecca. Rebecca worked for us for many years. We're sorry to have lost her. Looks like you're doing great. Kind of a brief overview of forest management, Minnesota DNR. The preponderance of our work is on 4.8 million acres of land, state of Minnesota owned lands. That sounds like a very big number, but it's not that big when you get to thinking about it. That's full spectrum management, from actively managed forestry lands to less intensively managed wildlife management areas to minimally managed state parks to not managed scientific natural areas. Also 40,000 acres of designated old growth. When you distill all that out, there are 2.5 million acres of productive timberland. The bulk of the remainder being lowland brush, wet meadows, peatlands, and stagnant timber. I think many of you are familiar with a study that we recently did. We hired Mason, Bruce, and Gerard to do a wood supply study for us and determine our sustainable harvest level. The outcome of that study was that we would be offering 870,000 cords of timber from that 2.5 million acres of working forest lands per year for the next 10 years. Plus we added 30,000 additional cords of ash and tamarack to accelerate management of those species due to emerald ash borer and the larch beetle. It is our intention to redo that STH in 10 years. So we've been at it for 2. In 8 years, we will redo it again and recalculate that sustainable number. Minnesota DNR is the single largest wood producer in Minnesota. We produce about 30% of the current supply needs. That's almost identical to Minnesota's counties in aggregate. In fact, on the timber end, county lands and state lands look very much alike. I see Mark Weber is coming up, I think, after me. I do have to point out that for Rebecca as well, that one of the big differences is that the land that Minnesota's counties and Wisconsin's counties manage is land that somebody wanted at one point in time. On Minnesota state lands, the vast majority of it, that is not true. Our timber program current revenue from fiscal year 2020 is about $20 million. That's down from a high of about $26 million about 3 years ago. That's mostly due to stumpage price increases, but also shifts in the marketplace. It's also due to less desirable species mix in that sustainable timber harvest analysis output. Our aspen volume will be dropping slightly in things like hardwoods, and that ash and tamarack I mentioned earlier is a larger piece. We've also had a lot of variable winters in Minnesota. It's resulted in a lot of wood on the books for us and declining sell rates, where there's areas that, especially where we have the preponderance of the landscape, people aren't buying timber because they're already holding plenty of their own. We also assist private landowners with a lot of their efforts. That was a program that was reinvigorated about 4 years ago. I did want to mention that we recently completed an analysis with the University of Minnesota. They took 2,000 of our landowner contacts through our private forest management program, and they surveyed all of them. A tremendous number responded, almost 66%. Some of the interesting things that came out of that, and what we were looking for, was our intention by reinvigorating the program was to increase timber in the marketplace. And of landowners that contacted us with a primary purpose of seeking timber sales assistance, 2/3 of those landowners followed through with the timber sale. And almost more interestingly, of landowners that contacted us with something else in mind, be it wildlife habitat or the other things that you would own land for, about 30% of those landowners either completed or intended to complete a timber sale in the near future. There were a lot of comments that came in on that survey. My favorite is that forestry is my favorite government agency. It's where we want to be. A lot of people don't even like government agencies, but if I can be anybody's favorite government agency, that is what I want to be. Recognize that a full 50% of what we do is wildfire work. Someone mentioned earlier the Western fires. We've had as many as 85 people on Western fires this year in spite of COVID. Actually, that was a concern early on, whether moving people around the landscape like that would be manageable, but we've done a pretty good job. Currently, we have 27 people, mostly in California. When it comes to COVID, I mean, especially as a manager, I don't even know what to say. It's dominated our decision-making. It's dominated our personnel management since last March. And sadly, you know, we don't really know where we're going from here. In Minnesota, most of our numbers are going in the wrong direction, depending on how you manage impact or measure impact. Your guess is as good as mine. We've been told that those of us that are able to work from home should plan on working from home until June. As a state agency, we work directly for Governor Walz. Governor Walz has taken a very strong stance with emergency declarations and executive orders relating to COVID. When you work for the executive branch of government, he is your chief executive and you do as he says. It has caused a little bit of consternation with some of our customers for sure, as a lot of people have certainly different perspectives on what proper management of COVID looks like. The way it works in Minnesota is, as was pointed out, the timber industry is a critically exempt industry from the beginning. So is wildfire suppression. It was nice that that fit into our cycle quite well as we sent people home to work. Many people never did go home because they were either actively working on getting ready for fire season or wrapping up their timber appraisals for the year, and they were able to continue that work. However, pretty much anything out of those two sectors required an exemption that had to be approved from Minnesota Management and Budget, and it's quite a lengthy process of putting together justification, numbers of people, and in fact, we don't have complete exemption for all of our work. Of our 450 employees, 400 are currently exempt, meaning that they can work in the field, they can work in their offices if necessary. However, we are under a very strict instruction that if we can do our work by telework, we will do our work by telework. So that's kind of the primary filter for all of our work, even if it is exempt. It's a standard day for a forester right now, even if they're working in timber, would be to do some work from home. And they would travel to the office and get their truck. They would go out to the forest, come back, and then do some work from home at the end of the day, spending very little time in the actual office. That obviously results in some inefficiencies, but if I had a choice, rather than being a manager, I'd be there with them today. They have a lot of freedom to do their work that other sectors of state government just don't have. We haven't changed any of our work targets or indicators, and we are meeting the key targets, including fire suppression and timber offered. Of the 450 employees that we have, I think I mentioned 400 are currently exempt and 50 are not. The 50 that are not are primarily planning staff and clerical positions that are only permitted to work from home. And again, that said, all positions, whether they're exempt or not, are required to telework if the work that they're doing can be done by telework. Rebecca mentioned auctions. We have a strong tradition of oral auctions, oral timber auctions here in Minnesota. It is clearly the preferred method by most purchasers of timber. Obviously, starting back in March, our big auction cycles are in June and December, and almost all of those June auctions were converted to sealed bid auctions. We're currently working on getting exemption status from MMB to have oral auctions going into December. It looks like if we're successful, those will be outside auctions, probably regardless of the weather. If we can find a good facility that has a pavilion or something like it, that will make it more tolerable. But as I said, Minnesota's numbers aren't great right now. Grand Rapids, which I'm in Marcel, Minnesota, just north of Grand Rapids, is kind of a hot spot. Their numbers are improving a little bit, but rates are still very high. It's likely that as we move through our auction cycle, we'll be forced to look ahead and see where those hot spots are and continue those auctions at a minimum as sealed bid. We've been meeting pretty regularly with the counties and with the U.S. Forest Service to talk about the effects of COVID in timber markets. It's been a nice piece of work, a great place to share information. The state of Minnesota's timber program is very tightly controlled by statute, so we don't have a lot of leeway of instantaneous decisions that we can make to offer timber relief, but we are working very hard, putting ideas on paper so that when our regular legislature convenes in January, we'll have a better understanding of what we want to do. We're looking at things like length of permit, as was mentioned, changing utilization standards. Extensions seem to be about the last thing that anybody wants. If there's a possibility of timber turnbacks, that may be a possibility as well, but we want to be ready come January with the best situation put together so that we're able to get the best fit for both Minnesota DNR and our timber purchasers. Like Wisconsin, one of the biggest impacts that we had is we were unable to complete our spring nursery lift. Basically, the nursery lost an entire year's worth of sales. We did plant on state land some trees that they had stored over the winter in the freezer. We also had some purchase trees that we planted, but only about 300,000 out of typically 4.5 million trees that we would plant on state lands in a given year. That obviously causes its share of problems. We lose the efficacy of our site prep. Some of that we'll wind up redoing, but we'll hopefully have a much bigger planting program next year to try and catch up. Out of all of that,
So,
Very good. Thank you, Tim. Again, good afternoon, everybody. Mark Weber, and I'm here on behalf of the Minnesota Association of County Land Commissioners, and I'll give you just a brief overview of Minnesota's county forest lands, first of all, before we get into the COVID-19 impacts. Tim? So Minnesota, the Lake states are kind of unique in that we have a third large public land owning agency in addition to Forest Service and state-owned lands. Minnesota, approximately 16% of the forest land ownership is county-owned, and so we're a large stakeholder. Next. And the counties are managing state tax forfeited lands. So what are tax forfeited lands? All these lands were once privately owned. They forfeited for non-payment of property taxes. They are actually owned by the state in trust for the taxing districts. These lands are administered by the county in which the land is located. Approximately 2.7 million acres in 15 northern counties. And of course, the land is open to public for hunting and outdoor recreation. Next. And just the history, it has a real unique history. Thousands of acres became tax delinquent during the Depression. Farms were abandoned, forests were abandoned due to cut and run logging and wildfires. Homesteads failed, and in 1935, the state legislature provided for tax forfeiture in an effort to return these lands to private ownership. And in the 1940s, the county land departments were established by state statute. And actually, forfeitures continued at a high level until the 1960s. Next, please. And then, beginning in the 80s, the counties realized the value of these lands and viewed them as assets to be retained and managed sustainably. With proper management, these lands could be used to strengthen local economies and generate revenue for the counties and the local taxing districts. The counties began to appoint professional staff, implemented resource policies, adopted new technologies, and actually enrolled in forest certification. Next, please. And the counties really have a dual statutory purpose. County boards have the discretion to decide that some tax forfeited land should be retained in public ownership and managed for public benefits, while other land should be returned to private ownership. So each year, the counties still get new forfeitures, and that first initial decision is, do we want to retain these lands and manage them, or place them back on the tax roll through land sale? Next, please. Statute also allows and requires apportionment. So the net proceeds from land sales, timber sales, and land rentals are apportioned as follows. And this is after we pay for our own expenses. County board may set aside no more than 30% for timber development, and this goes into our forest development account for planting and roads. And actually, it's a rainy day fund in case we have a bad year revenue-wise. County boards may set aside no more than 20% for recreation and economic development. And then the remaining balance is apportioned to the local taxing districts. 40% back to the county general fund, 40% to the school district, and 20% to the towns or the cities. Next, please. This map just shows the counties that have active land management programs. Again, 14 northern counties. They come in all sizes and shapes and different numbers of acres in the tax forfeited trust. St. Louis County has about 900,000 acres. And again, these are all these counties have their own county boards, et cetera. They're separate, yet we all share the same land use challenges, the same issues. So we have a close-knit group, and it's good to have people to talk about these common issues that we have. Next, please. And Minnesota's county forest lands, all the counties manage about 2.7 million acres. About 2 million acres are classified as commercial forest land. 1.4 are certified by FSI or FSC or both. County land operations do not receive funding from the tax levy. All our operations are funded from the sale and rental of our forest products and land sales. Our harvest levels are based on scientific sustainable data and individual county forest management plans, and probably about 150 total employees for all the counties. Next, please. And just to give you an idea of acres harvested, the Mackinac Counties, the 10-year average is about 35,000 acres. Next. In terms of volume in cords, the 10-year average is about 700,000 cords. Next, Tim. And now we'll talk a little bit about the COVID-19 impacts. Again, immediately, all the counties faced a closure of public buildings. Employees were required to work remotely if they could. Our field staff, because they were deemed essential, a lot of them were working out of their pickups initially and still continue to do that to this day. The counties were projecting a loss in property tax revenue. This is because businesses were being hit hard. Individuals were going to be hit hard with the impacts from the pandemic. And so there were hiring freezes and budget reductions, and of course, travel and meeting restrictions. Next. Closer to home, of course, we had the closure of the Verso paper mills. It affected mostly the northeastern counties, but also affects the other counties as well. Some of the counties faced a closure of county parks and recreational facilities. We had the loss of markets for our logging community, loss of revenue for loggers and truckers, and then all this affected our forest management plans and forest health issues. Next. And in terms of a response, all the counties initially had contingency plans to ensure continuity of services and operations. The goal was to provide essential services while minimizing risk to employees and the public. Essential field staff were and are working remotely. Trees were planted this spring and seedling has resumed. Certification audits are being conducted. Some of that is virtually. Our timber programs, for the most part, are in full operation. And we have been able to have, some of the counties have had oral timber auctions with safety precautions in place. That will likely continue to be a challenge, but we've been able to find venues that would allow that. Next, please. Initially, some of the counties, when things were first happening, had meetings with the local trade associations and loggers. Several of the counties have relaxed their extension policies for sales containing significant spruce fir volumes. Counties have relaxed the utilization standards for balsam fir and black spruce. Some counties reduced balsam fir prices on existing and future contracts. And some counties have relaxed their timber sale turnback policies. Next, please. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the CARES Act, but this was a federal act that allowed for funding to local units of government to reimburse expenses by individuals and businesses and government units. So for example, St. Louis County received about $26.4 million Some of that was to be distributed to the cities and towns within the county. But the county found a way to utilize that funding to provide relief grants. Some of that went to loggers for reimbursement of their timber sale down payments for turnback sales. Almost all the counties had relief grants for all small businesses in general. St. Louis County had developed some road clearing projects. And this was to put some of have work for some of our loggers who were hit hardest by the pandemic. And then the expenses paid by the county for safety precautions and any and all expenses that were required due to the pandemic can be reimbursed through CARES Act funding. So that has been very helpful for the counties. Next, please. And challenges moving forward. We've heard some of these already, of course, loss of our spruce, balsam fir, and black spruce markets, and those impacts to our forest management plans. You know, where several counties are using timber sales to mitigate some of the spruce budworm issues that we have. So that will be affected. We'll see what happens with our oral timber actions. We continue to have those going forward. And just the opening of public buildings and services and getting our remote workforce back in the office. And again, we've had a real issue filling job vacancies also. And St. Louis County, I think some of the other counties are looking to fill those positions, hopefully sooner than later. And then this whole training and information transfer issue where we have one person in a pickup, we haven't been able to have group training activities, person to person, et cetera. So very similar challenges as we've heard from some of the other speakers today. Next, please. So that's all I have for the moment. So if there's any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions pop up, Kim?
Hi, Chad. This is Deb Hawkins.
No, I don't think so.
I've got one. Hi.
Go ahead, Deb.
Hi, Mark. I was just listening to all the presentations today, and the challenges that the region faces are serious. I mean, if you were to think of what some of the opportunities are that you see coming out of all this, what would that be?
Some of the opportunities. Let's see, that's a very good question. You know, everybody's work habits have changed, and we'll see if having people working from home will continue. Certainly not our field people, but we have GIS staff and others that are working from home, and it appears to be working. So we'll see if that continues moving forward. The loggers have been very creative in finding some additional markets for balsam fir and for black spruce, and I guess I would see that as another opportunity that will hopefully will be utilized. As Craig said, we've had weekly, now monthly conversations with the DNR, with other counties, and with the Forest Service that have been very, very helpful, not just for COVID-19 related impacts, but just for the discussion of what's going on in our logging community as a whole. And so that has been very helpful, and we hope to continue with those conversations. Mm-hmm. So I guess we're hopeful that once we get through this pandemic, things will return to normal, but with maybe some efficiencies in place. But I think that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you giving that some thought and sharing with us.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mark. With that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Jeff Stampfly. Jeff is the acting chief and state forester for Michigan Department of Natural Resources, Forest Resources Division. Jeff has held several managerial positions in his professional career. His positions range from a forester to a fire officer. He has also served on national incident management teams. Prior to joining the DNR, Jeff worked in a family-owned logging and sawmill business in northern Lower Michigan. He earned his bachelor's degree in forest management from Michigan State University. So welcome, Jeff.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tim, were you going to be able to run the slideshow from there? Just like that. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is rather short, and it's not going to contain a whole lot of information from what you've previously heard. Michigan's story is quite similar to everyone else's. So it's a pretty short presentation. I'll kind of go through it rather quickly in order to try and help us with some time, and then allow for a little bit of questions at the end. So Michigan's, let's see, go ahead and go to the next slide. The timber industry, it's $21.2 billion to Michigan's economy annually. State forests provide 18% of the raw material used by Michigan forest products industry. The rest of it largely comes from non-industrial, private, and a combination of TMO and REITs, what used to be the large corporate ownerships. And the bulk of the rest of it would be federal through the Forest Service. And just to give you a few numbers for those that like numbers, in 2019, DNR staff prepared a little over 55,000 acres of timber for sale. This would be from state forest lands at just over 1 million cords. And then that same year, we sold roughly 60,000 acres of timber, with the bulk of that difference being stuff that was prepped out of a different year, or wood that would come from good neighbor authority agreements with the 3 national forests that we have. So for 20, which of course is the COVID year, state forest, we just finished up our fiscal year, and we did get 50,000 acres this year. So it was down some over last year. And the reasons for that will kind of get obvious as we go through what COVID did to us. That was almost 972,000 cords. G&A, we did a little over 4,200 acres at over 70,000 cords, bringing the total to about 54.4 with, again, over 1 million cords. Next slide, please. So the ownership in Michigan is again similar to what you've seen in Minnesota and Wisconsin. One of the significant, I guess, variations I would say is tax reverted land in Michigan throughout the boom and bust cycle that was mentioned in the other states largely went to the state, and it eventually became what was the state forest system. So forest land in general is about 20 million acres of forest in general in Michigan. State forests make up about 4.1 million acres of that. That would not include state game areas, would not include state parks. That would be state forest. 2.8 is national forest, and then the bulk of the forest land's made up again by private land of some version. And as the graphic shows you, most of the state forest lands either in the Upper Peninsula or northern Lower Michigan. And again, similar to other places, it's largely tax reverted. It makes up state forest, and revenue from the timber sales goes back to the funding source that acquired the land. So we do have some state game purchase lands, those kinds of other properties that are in the state forest system, and revenue from those sales goes back to the land, the acquisition fund for the land. Next slide. So COVID for us, like everybody else, kind of started about the second week of March, where it ramped up in earnest. And as a result, state employees were put on telework status, and we had very limited access to offices. In fact, I would say almost no access. So the stay home, stay safe order was in effect. It restricted travel. Unlike other places, our forestry staff weren't deemed essential workers under the definitions that we were working with. So we had about 8 weeks where we did not do any sale prep work at all. And essentially no work was allowed other than we did fight fire during that period of time.
Move it, move it, move it, move it.
We had a lot of snow in that time of the year, so fire didn't get to be a big issue. So that was what started for about 8 weeks. We suspended opening timber sales until we were able to do it remotely. And during that period of time, we did not do any sale admin either. But it did correspond again to breakup. So weight restrictions were on and industry was transitioning from winter work to summer work. Towards the end of that period of time, towards the end of March into April, first part of May, we did start to reoffer sales as we figured out ways to do it. We are sealed bid, but we require 2 people there to open them. So we had to work through those kinds of issues. We did get back to the field again, much to the similar restrictions of other people where it was one person per truck, couldn't go to the office, had to go to the woods direct from home, that sort of thing. We did not do any prescribed burnings, and we did have 10 weeks where staff were subjected to 1 layoff day per week. So in addition to the 8 weeks that we were in home, we also had some layoff days to contend with. We, like other places, have had a hiring freeze and a spending freeze. Those restrictions continue, and there are exemption processes in place that allow us to request exemptions. As far as spending freezes, we've been successful there, but hiring freezes, we have not been able to basically work through the process to get anyone hired yet. Next slide, please. So how did we adapt? We too went through, we essentially increased our room to bid. We lowered the minimum starting bids to allow a price break for sales once we did start selling them again. That didn't really seem to produce a lot of effect in that sales were still, bid up back to normal levels. We did evaluate contracts. We're pretty liberal in offering extensions. We also had some rather tough winter conditions. So we always look at winter extensions pretty much every spring. So both of those were into play. We looked at those. Lots of contacts, but it was different in that it was all through the phones because we weren't allowed to, to meet. We weren't allowed to really hardly administer sales other than one-on-one. And even then, there were masks involved in social distancing on the job. So lots and lots of phone calls. In some regards, it made staff a little easier to find because they weren't in the woods. They were at home where you could find them. One of the other things that was we did that was a big help is we had been heavily investing in mobile technology prior to COVID. So we already had a lot of mobile devices to do sale prep with, to do GPS work with, to do sale admin with. Most staff had smartphones, they had laptops. So it was pretty easy for field staff, at least, to transition over to remote teleworking. Our experience has been it's probably the office workers like in our central office in Lansing that have probably struggled it with the most. And a lot of the forestry staff have actually embraced it quite well, and that they work from home and then they get in their truck and go to the woods and then they come back. So the other thing I'll mention is during that 8 weeks when we weren't allowed to go to the field, we were able to let our contract prep work continue. And so we did have those sales being worked on, and we also allowed our timber sale contracts themselves to continue on. Once we were able to go back to work and start prepping sales and also start selling sales again, we tried to prioritize things we knew there were markets for. So red pine's always a good product for us. We tried to put those out. We knew that lowland wood, in particular lowland conifers, lowland hardwoods, are somewhat doggy on the market, so we stayed away from those. But in the Upper Peninsula and the East End in particular, it's hard to stay away from wet ground. Next slide, please. So challenges ahead. You know, COVID is still here, and like everybody else's numbers, ours are going up and are kind of going up with a vengeance. It's interesting. The county I lived in the Upper Peninsula went through all of last spring, all of summer, and basically our numbers were in the single digits. And September come along and it picked up a little bit, and now October's come along and it's really picked up to where my county went through all summer with, you know, 10, 12 cases, and we're up over 100 now. So a lot of parts of the state are going up. So this continues to be a problem. There was a court case that challenged the governor's executive orders, and they ultimately were voided. And so that's left some scrambling done to try and put some things in place. It's largely through the health department and MIOSHA in order to deal with some of the restrictions needed for COVID. So what had been a fairly consistent set of regulations is now kind of become consistent, but through other mechanisms to keep them in play. I mentioned hiring and spending freeze. Those are still in play. Don't see them going away anytime soon. We don't have an official return date back to the offices. It's going to be at least January. I heard one of the presenters mention June. We haven't heard that yet, but realistically, it's going to be a while. And the other thing we'll have to look at is what sort of measures we want to take as we go through winter and into spring, where we may have suspended something or altered processes temporarily that will need to become more permanent. And then, of course, you know, as the last bullet says, communicate and collaboration. There'll be lots of that going forward. And next slide, which is the question slide. So that was it. Not a lot of new info compared to other states.
So Jeff, you have a question. We'll get through that now. How is Michigan DNR administering hardwood timber sale contract extensions for those in the Lower Peninsula and East End impacted by Verso? No longer getting Verso contract and no longer getting, same thing, no longer getting a Verso contract.
Yeah, so basically we don't, our sales predominantly expire or run out either end of December or end of June, although they could run out at any time of the year. We've got a set of protocol that we look at, like market conditions, weather conditions, and those sorts of things. And basically we deal with the extensions as they come up. And so if loggers got sales that they know they've had trouble with, such as the loss of Verso, then we look at those on a case-by-case basis. We talked about doing some blanket stuff this fall, but kind of held off doing it, knowing that markets seem to be all over the board. The other thing I'll mention is we have noticed a definite uptick in this number of sales going no bid, in particular the west end of the UP, and in particular things that involve hardwood pulpwood. So I could see us needing to take some action there as time moves on.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. We appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to move on to our next and last speaker, who is Steve Koonin. Steve is the Director of Renewable Resources in the Eastern region of the U.S. Forest Service. As the Director of the Eastern region for the last 4.5 years, Steve has overseen all renewable resource programs, including timber management. Steve has worked closely with units across the region and the Lake States to successfully plan and deliver these programs. Prior to this, Steve spent time as a Deputy Forest Supervisor in the Pacific Northwest and as a district ranger in the Superior National Forest. Steve began his career as a timber management assistant and silviculturist in Southwest Virginia. So please welcome Steve.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Afternoon, sorry. And I think Tim or somebody has a presentation. So first and foremost, I'd want to say thank you guys. Thank you all very much for inviting me to participate not only here, but to hear what each of the other states are doing. This is one of the most important things I found for us as the agency, as the Forest Service agency, is to stay connected. And so I appreciate the opportunity to stay connected. The other thing I would add before we get into my slides is that I added a whole bunch of animations to the slides, thinking I was going to be doing it here, but it's going to be easier for you guys to do it. So as we move forward from this slide into the other slides, you can just toggle through each of the animations until we get to the, the final set of animations. So if we can move forward to the next slide, please. Again, my name is Steve Ken. Oh, perfect. Director of Renewable Resources. And how we think of the region in terms of, we think of it in terms of three tiers, the Lake States tier, the Southern tier, and the Appalachian Mountains. And it covers the geographic landscape of Maine to Maryland and Minnesota to Missouri. And so I know you guys really want to focus in on the Lake States, and so we'll get there in a moment. But by and large, generally, the total acreage that we have in the region is about 12.3 million acres, and total suitable acres that we can actually practice timber harvest on are about roughly half of that. And in the Lake States, that number is about 7.2 million acres with a total suitable base in those forests, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, about 3.8 million acres. So that kind of gives you a sense of how we're distributed across the landscape. But as you think about the regional program, there's a lot of things that we're operating on and thinking about doing. Every year we're establishing 40,000 acres or more of vegetation. So that's a kind of clear cutting. 30,000 acres of different types of activities like thinning or TSI, approximately 150,000 acres of habitat. We do fuels reduction. We work in streams and lakes. We work in road maintenance, 5,500 to 6,500 miles per year, and then timber volume. So last year, our timber program was about 660 million board feet. This year, right now, the initial plan is to be at the 700 million board foot level. So what does that mean? So as we move to the next slide, please. What that means is over the last, here's our information from 2008 to present. And the 21 number is a planned amount, and that really is dependent on the appropriated budget that we receive nationally. So for about a decade or so, 7, 8 years, we were somewhere in the neighborhood of around 400 million board feet. Over the last 5 years, we've seen some pretty significant increases in our program, moving from a little bit over 500 million in 2016 to close to 700 or a little bit over 700 million in 2021. So at least that's the plan. Of that volume, over the last couple of years, about 490 million of that came out of the Lake States. Of the total of 660 million, we had about 490 come out of the Lake States in 2020, and in 2021, the plan is to have about 521 million. So there's a significant portion of the program, of the regional program, comes out of the Lake States National Forest. And one additional item, there's about 196 separate contracts in each of those total in 6 national forests. So there's a lot of contracts that we deliver. I think the average size of our contracts is somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million board feet. That's the average size. There are definitely some that are larger and definitely some that are smaller, but that's the general size. Could we go to the next slide, please? And so the breakout, the way the Forest Service operates, we have a number of different contracting mechanisms and tools that we can utilize. Traditional sales are either tree measurement sales or scaled sales. We have a tool called stewardship contracting where we can use either timber contracts or agreements to have essentially other people operate the timber sale. In an agreement, a third party individual or a third party group will manage the timber sale, where in a stewardship contract, the actual person who purchases the contract manages the contract and the associated work. Good Neighbor Authority, I do want to point out, you know, in 2018 and in 2020, Good Neighbor Authority has become a pretty significant proportion of the program for the Eastern region. And you know, I got to call out to the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. They've really, we've really established some, well, not only established, but have maintained some incredibly positive relationships through the Good Neighbor Authority program. So having been working with the states in those programs, it's just been very phenomenal. And in some ways that has really helped, that work with the states has really helped not only our relationships and how we're working with purchasers, but also our relationships with industry, and in broad sense, as COVID hit, our relationships in general, it really helped having a more close connection and tie to the different factors at play. We do track total receipts. Now this is pre-treasury, because off the top there's a certain proportion of their timber sale receipts that we receive go to treasury. So in 2020, our total timber sale receipts were about 36 million, and that was down 25% over 2019. So we saw a pretty significant reduction in the total amount of receipts received. That kind of gives you a sense of the market and the market indicators. And that's broken out by these different authorities that we have. So we can collect some of the timber sale receipts, and some of them can go towards improving forest land conditions within the sale area, like reforestation. Some of it can go towards salvage. So, you know, we take money and we put it right into salvage. Some of the money can be taken and put into out-year program work. And so that's kind of what you see as the breakdown between the different authorities we have and how we can put it out. So the NFF proportion goes to the Treasury. So can we go to the next slide, please? So now that's kind of a broad overview. In specific response to COVID, there's a very limited authority that we have to adjust our timber sale contracts once they've been let. And basically the primary two methodologies, one is the substantial overriding public interest, where basically we were given the authority to, if upon purchaser request, unilaterally extend contracts. And so that was the first thing, and that happened, I think, sometime in March, April, or May of this year. So most of the contractors have requested, and I think we've processed most of the contract extensions. The other tools within the contract themselves is we can provide contract term adjustments and extensions, and those are either market related or they're related to weather. And as long as the purchaser's actively operating and completing the sale, then we have the ability to provide extensions and adjustments to the contract terms. Most of the facility that we have to modify timber sales is on new timber sale contracts. And so as you kind of take a look here, we first and foremost, some of the things that we've done, we really spent some time talking to industry. We've talked to the states, and in fact, I know several several national forests are having ongoing conversations with counties, state, industry partners to kind of have a sense of what's going on and what are some things that we can do in order to make our timber sales more, basically more economically viable. Then within the actual contract, we have the ability to make changes in what we advertise or how we're going to advertise. And it depends on the silvicultural considerations. We have the ability to change the contract length, for example. We can make the contract length 3 years instead of 2 years. We can reduce rates, the appraisal rates or the bid values, depending on the market conditions. We have the ability to look at seasonality. So as we take a look at the specific NEPA document, we can adjust the seasonality of certain payment units. And so it could be a winter and dry ground as opposed to just a winter operation. So we have some flexibility in how we take a look at our preparation, the seasonality of our, and then the last thing has to do with optional material. So as we take a look at, you know, like spruce fir is kind of gotten to be a big thing on the Superior National Forest because of the current markets. And so they've evaluated whether or not we're going to make that as a required removal or an optional removal. So we've taken a look at different things on a forest by forest basis to evaluate and determine how we're going to consider sales, but that has to be on a local unit by unit basis. And so we have asked each of the national forests to evaluate each sale that's coming up. and then take a look at what are these factors and conditions that they're looking at. And then we ask them to, if possible, to adjust those elements in their timber sale to make it more economically viable. We have had a couple of no bids this year. I think a couple of no bids occurred on the Ottawa National Forest. And so we are paying attention to that. And essentially, whenever we do have a no bid, we ask the unit to specifically contact local industry reps, purchasers, and just kind of get a sense of what's going on, and then make a determination how we're going to change it, or whether we should even re-advertise the sale, depending on what's going on with the current market. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there are some effects that we've had with our staff, and there are a bunch of different things that are going on. You've probably heard a lot of them. There's initial and ongoing adjustments. So from the personnel side, people, at first, things were great. People were happy to be at home. They were able to balance their work life. A lot of times in Milwaukee, we have people driving in, it could be an hour to get into the office. In other communities, it's a half hour, 45 minutes. So there's a lot of really good stuff. That people found. But as this has continued, now kids are back in school. And so not only some of the schools, at least here, we have virtual 100% school. And so you're sharing an office space with a school space. And it's put a lot of strain on people on their ability to be able to juggle and manage the personal and the professional things. So our staff is continuing to figure that out. Additionally, in the short term, there was about 2 months where the Forest Service at large was trying to figure things out. People were still going into the field, but we had to figure out how we were going to deal with the social distancing. What mask were we going to wear? What kind of personal protective equipment were we going to provide, or could we provide? We had to go through all those things and really figure out what we could do to provide a safe environment for our employees. The other thing is we have some traveling, what we call a strike team of timber folks. We've actually stood them down, and they're working locally now because of the travel and the concern about exposing people to different locations and their local families. So we've had to adjust some of how we operate as well with some of those folks. The second thing that we've really seen is there are a lot of differences state to state and even locality to locality. And so we've really had to navigate each forest and each district, in some cases, is navigating those differences. So for example, in the state of Michigan, in part, some areas were able to put up their Good Neighbor Authority sales, others weren't. And so just trying to figure out how do we navigate those things, and then how do we balance those differences across the region so we can continue to hit our timber program targets and yet accommodate those individual nuances that are occurring at each one of the locations. We've challenged by onboarding new hires. I mean, not only are we having to hire new folks, but how do we onboard them? How do we bring people together? And then we're thinking about new cost centers. So, cost centers is we've had to rent a lot of vehicles that we normally wouldn't have had to rent because we're trying to maintain social distance between our employees. And so if you have a crew of 8, you might be carrying 3 or 4 vehicles. So, those are some things to think about in terms of how costs may have increased a little bit for the Forest Service because of the COVID. We're also paying attention to markets. Markets are really important in terms of how we package our timber sales, how we put together and what species mix we're providing, what the term of the lengths of the contracts are, and things like that. So we've spent a lot of time trying to figure those out, and those are also longer term impacts too, because we've been hearing, it might be June or July before we're even thinking about bringing everybody back to the office. And that's different on a location by location basis. So we're trying to figure all those things out and continuing to figure those things out as we move forward. The last thing is our partners. And, industry, I consider industry as an important partner here in the Lake States and actually around the region, because a lot of our land management activities are accomplished through your work in terms of revenues generated because of our timber sales. But we also have a number of other partners that we work very closely with, Nature Conservancy, National Wild Turkey Federation, Rough Grouse Society, who have taken on, who do a lot of work. We do a lot of work with those folks. And in some ways, they've been hit very economically in a big way. So Turkey Federation had to lay off a number of people. I think the Rough Grouse Society has laid off a number of people. Nature Conservancy has also laid off folks. So, you know, how our partners are able to continue, how we're able to continue working with our partners has been something that we're trying to continue figuring out. What's the new balance look like? What's the new working paradigm? You know, and even with our work in the States through Good Neighbor Authority has been, it's been really good. The relationships have been, you know, really important and continue to be really positive. But I know the states have the challenges with hiring freezes, and we're looking at increasing our program. So how do we balance those freezes and the increases to our program and the work that we're asking our partners to provide? So that's by and large kind of the effects that we've had and what we're continuing to work on and think about. And I think that there's one other thing that we've been thinking about too. There's a couple of other things I'd like to add. First of all, planting season. So this year we actually canceled our planting season in the Lake States because of where the planting crews were coming from. And I want to say that some of the, from what I understood, some of the states had canceled their planting program too. So as we think about planting in 2021, now we're thinking about, well, how do we double the planting program? In thinking about, will we have the contract space? Will the contractors have the time? You know, all those factors are coming into play now. So we're trying to think, what does the next 1 to 3 years look like as we've pushed back some of these programmatic things that we normally would have done in a kind of spread out manner. Now they might be condensed and concentrated a little bit, so it'll be a little bit more difficult for us to work through. The last thing is our fire response. So as an agency, we're continue to be charged with fire. And this is from what I've been, basically from what you guys are all aware, this has been an unprecedented fire season. And so how are we responding? Where does the Eastern region fit into that? We have sent a number of people to the tune of several hundred folks out west to help support the fire response. And so that's going to continue to be a bigger question in the agency, is how are we managing and balancing that? And we each have our role to play, and thank goodness we haven't had a huge fire season here. And I know, you know, at any one given time, we probably could have a pretty significant fire. So it's just thinking, how do we play and work in that environment where we've got all these draws and pulls on our attention. I think the last thing that I would mention is that as a federal agency, we've seen an unprecedented number of people coming to the National Forest this year that are affecting our transportation systems, that are affecting our recreation areas, that are just affecting the general forest. Now, Congress did pass something called the Great American Outdoors Act, which is intended to help us with our transportation systems and our facilities backlog. So we are getting some support to, fortunately, we're getting some support to figure out how do we balance that huge increase in what we're seeing on the landscape. And I assume, I've heard the same thing from the states, that the states are seeing pretty significant upticks in people just coming to visit the woods and connect with nature. And so as we work through that, that's going to have an impact on counties, that's going to have an impact on states, it's going to have an impact on federal land. So it's really important for us to be thinking about that in terms of how do we as land managers work through that and think through that. And, I know that, as the Forest Service, we probably have some rec areas, the state has some rec areas, the county has rec areas. How do we balance that? How do we work together? How do we think through some of those things and make sure that we're kind of not working at cross purposes, but working in tandem. And so I think I did see that this is my last slide. And so I did see a couple of questions in there, but I just want to make sure to recognize that not only, we did have a pretty big blowdown this year on the Chequamegon Nicolet, as you guys are all aware, that affected not only our lands, but state lands, private lands, and county lands. And so I would put out there, I just want to recognize, not only did industry in large part help to respond to that, as people were moving across state lines, as industry was moving across state lines, counties, states, national forests were extending contracts that weren't salvaged to allow people to move to the salvage. I want to recognize that was a pretty big effort. And and just recognize that the counties helped out with our Good Neighbor Authority, the state helped out with the Good Neighbor Authority, but it was a big effort. And I just want to throw out kudos to all those folks and the industry partners who participated in helping us work through that, because that has been a big lift for the state. And I see it as a measure of success of the partnership that I see between the state, the Forest Service, the counties, private lands, as well as industry. And with that, I would pause and say, are there any questions?
Steve, there's a couple questions. Why don't you read those? We got a question earlier I'll get to first.
Okay.
We'll give you time to get prepared. So this question is for Craig Schmid. There's a high percent of no bids the past 2 years. Any comments on better cell design or adjusting minimums to get the work at the field level completed?
Sure. You know, the cell rates vary, and there's probably lots of reasons that they vary. Our cell rate is actually increasing in the tower area, which has had historically low cell rates for probably about 5 years. So it's not a universal phenomenon. Certainly a big part of it is what we're offering, and what we're offering in terms of what our STH outputs are. The sustainable timber harvest outputs are by species. So we monitor that as well and make sure those are proportional. So we're certainly offering, you know, our old target was 870 or 800,000 cords. Now it's 870 plus 30. And that additional 70 plus 30 is a lot of tamarack, ash, hardwoods, some other things that typically aren't huge market producers. So, you know, we're working on sale design and packaging sales all the time. We reduce sale prices from auction to auction every time we reoffer them 30%, sometimes more if we can justify it. We've been having meetings with timber producers when we could meet in person over the last couple of years to discuss things like sale design, and I've come up with some good input from that. So, you know, we always want to sell what we offer, for sure. We got effort in it. We have a cost in it for the school kids and the school of trust, and we're always looking at ways that we can improve that. So thanks for the question.
Okay, Steve, a couple for you quickly. Deals with the KV funds and salvage fund. Appears to be imbalance between what is spent in the salvage fund and the KV funds in the lake states. Question is, I think you can read the question, so why don't you give that a shot?
Yeah, absolutely. The slide I showed was a region-wide number. It wasn't a lake state specific number. So those were just broad numbers that I pulled from the regional amount, and the lake states are definitely lower than that. By and large, we keep any KV funds or any salvage sale funds, they stay local to the maximum extent possible. I don't think that I pulled any KV or salvage until they're converted to K2. At which point in time they could be spread throughout anywhere in the region. But as long as the KV plan allows for it to be in that location, we keep it there. And so the numbers that I pulled and provided, 12.6 and 10.8, are specific, are generally to the whole region, and specifically on each of the units, it is lower than that. And I can get those numbers. I think I probably provided them in the past. The second question that I see is, are stewardship agreements and Good Neighbor Authority possibilities for addressing tree planting backlogs? As a matter of fact, when I was on the Schwamgen in September with the Undersecretary's visit, that was exactly the question I asked of the forest, if we could use Good Neighbor Authority to think about planting, but not only maybe think about planting, but plant state, federal, and private lands across land ownerships. So thinking about how could we do that in partnership, so you don't need 3 different contracts or 3 different contractors, but maybe pitch the idea that we could do it through one sale or one contracting vehicle, and then just have them plant across land ownership. So it's definitely something. I'd have to look at the statutory authority on specifically how we could expend stewardship dollars to make sure that, you know, I'm not getting crossed up there. But I think by and large there's some opportunity there that we definitely would be willing to explore. Another question is Chief Christensen concerned at all about the impact on nation's loggers and log trucks? And if so, is she willing to speak with Secretary Perdue about including them in the USDA COVID relief program, impact of COVID? I by and large can't speak for Chief Christensen. I know that we have expressed from a regional perspective, and we have had regional conversations at our regional directors meetings about our concerns about the impacts of COVID on our infrastructure, specifically our logging infrastructure. So we have had conversations. That information does get put up. And furthermore, what I would say, and this is probably a good thing for you guys to know, Paul Strong, who was the forest soup on the Chequamegon is now the acting director, national director for forest management. And so this is something that we could easily make sure it's whispered in his ear, so that she continues to keep that in front of her. So would she be willing to speak to the secretary? I assume that she would, but I'm not exactly sure what's all at play in terms of the conversations they have, but that's definitely something, and this is definitely a message that we will continue to push up to the national office, that there are some significant impacts, and the success of the Eastern region is predicated upon a strong industry, and without a strong industry, our success goes away dramatically. And so I would leave it there.
Hey, Steve, I will tell you, Undersecretary Hubbard has had that conversation, and that's ongoing. And FRA, along with the American Loggers Council, are working to get some relief for the loggers and the situations they're facing with the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So with that, we'll move on quickly. I just want to give Deb Hawkinson an opportunity to thank the speakers. Deb, you got a few words to say?
Yes, thanks, Tim. I just wanted to thank all the speakers for just sharing with us your insights that are happening across the Lake States, and also for all of our participants today, FRA members and others that have joined us. And I unknowingly was encouraging everyone to stretch earlier when I was, I think my move it comment came out loud and clear. So apologize for that, but do want to encourage us to move around. But again, thanks everyone. It was great seeing you, and I appreciate you participating.
Okay, Chad, back to you.
Yes. So again, yes, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. And as a member of the forest industry, I want to thank you for finding a way to do your job and have your organization continue with their work during this COVID pandemic. Without you, we would probably be struggling ourselves to keep our operations going. So thanks for that. We're going to move on to our award segment, our presentation of our Outstanding Logger of the Year. I'm going to turn this over to Ray Higgins from the Timber Producers Association.
Thanks, Chad. And I will tell you that I was in the woods and I just on my way back, so I kind of pulled the chute and I pulled over. So I'm talking to you from my vehicle, but it is great to be with you all and great to honor FRA Forest Products of Two Harbors, Minnesota as the Lake State's Outstanding Logger of the Year. So we'll go through the presentation a little bit. Next slide, please. Blake. There's Blake with his wife, Sue, daughter Sasha and Sarah, son Brock. Sue does the books for FRA Forest Products. Brock joined the company full-time after graduating from high school in 2018, so he's a big part of Blake's operation, and Blake is there on the left. So a little bit about the history of the business. Bruce Farron, Blake's father, if you could flip to the next slide, please, had been working at Reserve Mining in Silver Bay in Minnesota along the North Shore for 15 years, but it was in an era when taconite mining in Minnesota was in free fall, and the end of the line for Reserve came in 1986. Bruce found himself out of work, so he and a partner headed for the woods. As Blake would say, his dad went to logging to create a job for himself. So working at Reserve all those years, Bruce didn't figure he'd end up as a business owner. In hindsight, the timing was perfect to get into the logging business. The Louisiana Pacific siding plant in Two Harbors had just opened, so some of the wood they harvested went there. Bruce and his partner felled the timber by hand using a cable skidder to get the wood to the landing, and what didn't go to LP was sold as firewood. As Blake got older, next slide please, he helped out when he could on weekends and in the summer, as so many have gotten into the business. By the time Blake was ready to graduate from Two Harbors High School in 1993, Bruce was ready to dissolve his partnership and take on his son as his partner. So soon after that, Bruce and Blake were still cutting timber by hand. Next slide, please. They ultimately decided to start purchasing equipment. Their first feller buncher and their first grapple skidder, eventually added a stroke limber and loader slasher, rounding out a conventional set of logging equipment. As they added equipment, if you can hit the next slide, please, the Ferens needed to add people too, but the growth was closely managed. They wouldn't overextend themselves. Blake said, Dad was conservative. I always wanted more, but he always slowed us down, and that might have saved us through times when times got tough. So that's, you know, pretty strong insight, Blake and his father. Next slide. By 2013, always looking for ways to expand and be more versatile, the Ferens saw another opportunity. The supply of timber offered for sale by public agencies in the Two Harbors area seemed to exceed demand. Their solution was to dip their toe into the world of cut to length. In 2017, then Bruce retired, and Blake became sole proprietor of Feren Forest Products, LLC. Next slide, please. Blake always puts an emphasis on hiring the right people. The company has 8 employees between the 2 crews and a couple of truckers. In addition, contract haulers are hired when necessary throughout the year to complete their deliveries to the mills. And Blake, you know, has great words for his crew, saying that their crews are a big reason why we are where we are. If you surround yourself with good people, it's hard to look bad. Everyone works well together. We have great crews. Next slide, please. Today, the company runs a cut-to-length crew with a harvester and 2 forwarders, in addition to its conventional crew, so 2 crews total. Typically, all 3 cut-to-length machines operate on the same site at the same time. That maximizes their production while enjoying the benefits and versatility of the cut-to-length machines. In the community, next slide, please. Blake supports the Two Harbors and Lake County community in a variety of ways, from entering one of his trucks in the annual Heritage Days Parade in town, to donating materials for the yearly kids scavenger hunt, donating to Minnesota's Log a Load for Kids program, and participating in the SAF annual forestry field day for 5th graders in the nearby Duluth School District. One notable project I want to tell you about Feren Forest Products participated in was with St. Louis County and the Lake Superior Steelhead Association in an effort to improve stream banks on the Knife River along the north shore of Lake Superior. Next slide, please. Slumping clay banks were contributing to the sediment load in the river as a result of rain and high water events, resulting in the Knife being listed among Minnesota's impaired waterways. Red pine harvested by Feren was used along with other material to rebuild and reshape the riverbank on the Knife River, improving steelhead habitat. Kevin Bovee of the Steelhead Association said of the Ferens, talk about being good at their job. These guys were great. Their efforts in the woods will benefit the river and the cold water fishery for decades to come. And it's just one of many accolades Feren Forest Products has received over the years. Next slide, please. Stakeholders from landowners, land managers, and timber purchasers appreciate working with Feren and his crew. Here's a quote from Verso Sarah Dieterville. Blake Feren and his company display excellence in many ways with their professionalism and the way they harvest their sites, their delivery of their timber, and their business conduct as a whole, striving for excellence in all aspects of the operation. Pride in a job well done is a hallmark of Feren Forest Products. Like so many in Minnesota, next slide please, Feren crew members are annually trained through the Minnesota Logger Education Program. All employees have completed the core forest management guideline training module. And next slide please. He also utilizes modern equipment that enables the workforce to harvest timber products safely. All employees regularly attend Log Safe, the CPR and first aid training every other year, and safety training in the opposite year of CPR. And in addition, next slide please, Blake serves on the board of directors for the Minnesota Logger Education Program and Minnesota Timber Producers Association. So the final slide, in April, Feren Forest Products was recognized as the Logger of the Year by the Minnesota Sustainable Forestry Initiative Implementation Committee. And today, FRA recognizes Blake Feren and Feren Forest Products, LLC, as the Lake States Region Outstanding Logger.
Thank you, Ray.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of Blake, who's a great representative of logging in our state and in the Lake States region.
Jacob, could you go to the last slide, please? Is there one more? There you go. I see Blake. Blake, you're on here. It looks like a couple of your daughters are on as well. But on behalf of FRA, we'd like to present present you with a certificate from Steel to buy for a chainsaw. Looks like a rather large chainsaw. I'm not sure loggers carry chainsaws anymore, but you'll have one carry around in your truck. You will also receive a $250 award from Steel Corporation as well, and you will also receive a plaque and a recognition from FRA, which we will get all this to you at some point here in the future. I'll get together with Ray and Rick Horton and hook up with you guys. And also, you will be entered to compete for the National Logger of the Year award, which someone will be recognized in I think at our meeting in Nashville, which is in 2021. So Blake, if you'd like to say a few words, feel free.
Yeah, I guess thank you very much to everybody. There's a lot of nice things said about us as a business, and just want to thank everybody. And yeah, a lot of credit has to go to our employees and, family. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. Chad, I'll turn it back to you.
Congratulations, Blake. It's a great achievement.
Thank you.
Yes, same for me, Blake. I've known Blake and his dad for a long time, and they're good loggers, they're good businessmen, and they're good people. So it's well deserved. I'm glad you got it this year, Blake.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, I'm very honored. Also, I mean, it's a big award, and yeah, I guess a lot of people had to I don't know, say a lot of nice things about me, I guess, for me to be here. So thank you.
It was well worth it.
Thanks, Chad.
If no one else has any questions, I think we're going to wrap it up today. So thanks for attending, and thanks Tim and the FRA crew, and we'll hope to see you all in person next fall.